How the UFC became a $12 billion empire. January 2001. 3 men buy a dying fight promotion for $2 million. The company has 12 fighters, 1 octagon, and is hemorrhaging money. 23 years later, they'll sell it for $4 billion. And today, it's valued at $12 billion. This is the story of how the UFC became the most profitable fight business in history, and why the fighters who bleed for it are still fighting over scraps. November 1993, the first Ultimate Fighting Championship. No weight classes, no rounds, almost no rules. Fighters from different martial arts styles enter an 8-sided cage to answer one question. Which style is superior? It's brutal, shocking, and briefly popular. And then the backlash hits. Senator John McCain calls it a blood sport for the dark ages and human cockfighting. He pressures cable companies to drop it. And by 2000, the UFC is banned in 36 states and blocked from most pay-per-view markets. The owners have burned through $44 million and they're ready to shut it down. Enter Dana White, a 31-year-old boxing manager in Vegas. He sees potential that nobody else does, but he doesn't have $2 million, so he makes a call. Lorenzo and Frank are brothers who own casinos worth hundreds of millions of dollars and are childhood friends of Dana White. Lorenzo has a seat on the Nevada State Athletic Commission, which is the key to legitimizing the sport. In January 2001, they buy the UFC for $2 million. They get 12 fighter contracts, 1 octagon, and massive debt. The Fertittas immediately start bleeding cash, $40 million in the first few years to be exact. But they have money to burn and a long-term plan. They work alongside athletic commissions to create unified rules, weight classes, rounds, gloves, and the UFC transforms from spectacle into legitimate sport. But there's still one problem. Nobody's watching. Cable networks won't touch it. They need exposure but can't buy it, so they build it themselves. 2005. The Fertittas fund a reality TV show out of their own pocket, The Ultimate Fighter. 16 unknown fighters compete for a UFC contract. Spike TV decides to air it, but only because the UFC produces it entirely for free. On April 9th of that same year, Forrest Griffin and Stephen Bonner face each other in the season finale. For 3 rounds, they trade punches and kicks, and neither man backs down. The crowd is on its feet. Viewers at home can't look away. Dana White is so moved that he gives both men a contract on the spot. Overnight, the UFC becomes a cultural conversation. Pay-per-view buys explode. States start sanctioning events, and sponsors come calling. In 5 years, the UFC goes from an underground curiosity to a mainstream sport, all from one last-ditch idea to try a reality TV show. By 2010, the UFC had cracked the code, and here's how they make their money. Pay-per-view. The UFC charges $70 to $80 per event. Major card does 500,000 buys, Conor McGregor card over $2 million, so that's $150 million in a single night. They do these pay-per-view events every single month. And, unlike boxing, the UFC owns everything. Promotion, fighters, production. They keep 80 to 90% of revenue. Then they have live gates. UFC 229 McGregor vs Khabib was a $17.2 million gate, meaning they made $17.2 million from ticket sales to the event. Most big events pull in around $5 to $10 million. They also have broadcast deals. In 2019, ESPN paid the UFC $1.5 billion for 5 years. That's $300 million per year guaranteed. And finally, they have sponsorships. Crypto.com pays $175 million for a 10-year deal with the UFC. But here's the genius. The UFC doesn't just promote fights, they manufacture stars. Press conferences become theatre. Trash talk becomes storylines. McGregor versus Khabib wasn't just a fight, it was ego versus discipline, showman versus warrior, a cultural event. As Dana White once said himself, we're in the storytelling business. The fights are just the payoff. However, there's a darker side. UFC fighters are independent contractors and not employees. There's no health insurance, no retirement, and no union. The UFC pays fighters 15 to 18% of their entire revenue. The NBA, on the other hand, pays 50%. The NFL is 48%. A mid-tier UFC fighter makes $20,000 to show and $20,000 to win. Out of that, they pay coaches, training, travel, medical bills, and taxes. For entry-level fighters, it's even less. $10K to show up and fight, and another $10K if you win. Imagine training for 15 years to make the UFC. You lose a close decision in your first fight, get knocked out in your second, and then you're cut from the UFC. 15 years of brain damage for $20,000. Fighters who speak out get cut or buried on the undercard. The UFC's leverage is simple. If you want to fight at the highest level, this is the only cage that matters. They have a monopoly. In 2016, the Fertitta brothers sold the UFC to the WWE IMG for $4 billion. Dana White stayed on, and the new owners expanded internationally. By 2023, the UFC was valued at $12 billion, but there are cracks that are starting to show. the pay-per-view numbers have plateaued. Sport hasn't produced another McGregor-level star, and fighter pay disputes are getting louder and louder. Francis Ngannou, the heavyweight champion, walked away in 2023 over contract disputes, and a class action antitrust lawsuit accuses the UFC of operating as a monopoly and suppressing fighter pay. The empire is profitable, but no longer untouchable. So, from a banned underground show to a $12 billion empire, the UFC rewrote the rules of combat sports. They turned chaos into structure, spectacle into sport, and fighters into commodities. It's one of the most ruthlessly efficient business models in sports history. But in an empire built on blood, who really wins? If you've enjoyed this video, please subscribe. Feel free to check out the video on screen.